Good. So ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Know that poem? So yesterday we ended by looking briefly at the kind of obstacles that we all encounter in our attempt to follow Jesus, to love one another, or as Shantideva, we've been using him as a kind of a parallel reference point, to live a way of life, the bodhisattva way of life, a way of life that is characterized by our concern for others, for the well-being of others, rather than ourselves. Now, as in all dialogue, religious dialogue, or in any sort of work of translation, you can't claim that there is a total 100% equivalence between one word and the translation, or between one idea and another idea in another tradition, another culture. Nevertheless, if we are human, if we believe in the unity of the human family, if we believe in the oneness of God, then there must be important points in common. There must be a fundamental resonance in the truth and in wisdom as expressed in different forms. And that's why I think we can come back to our own language, to our own culture, to our own faith tradition with a better understanding after we have entered into dialogue and learnt from others. The Church, Catholic Church, having for a long time, and Christians for a long time, having rejected really any possibility of dialogue, has now gone back to the spirit of the early Church, in which we say that we reject nothing that is true and holy in other religions. It's a fundamentally different attitude towards our own uniqueness of our own faith and what is true and holy in other faiths. So there are, not surprisingly, quite a lot of similarities in the way that different traditions will describe the problems we create for ourselves, or the internal obstructions and patterns and so on that we find as we try to escape from this pit of loneliness and expand and find ourselves liberated into the solitude of love, the solitude that we have to, in which we embrace and accept ourselves as we are, uniquely, in order that we can love, because we cannot love fully unless we can love ourselves, unless we can be in solitude. So the acceptance of our own imperfections, of our own failings, is an essential element of our journey. And Jesus reserves his anger with religious people primarily for the Pharisees, who maintain a kind of illusion of perfection based upon the observance of external rules and regulations, while outside they are painted sepulchres, and inside they are full of corruption and hypocrisy. So this is what makes Jesus really angry, because that kind of hypocrisy, that kind of double standard, that kind of superficiality it becomes projected outwards in forms of religion that block other people, that prevent the sharing and the liberation of the spirit of true wisdom and love, which is at the heart of any true revelation of God. And that's why he says, you put all this emphasis upon external rules and regulations, but you are actually blocking other people from coming to God. So the first step, as he tells us, is to be aware of our own imperfections, of our own failings, and not wasting any time. And we waste a lot of time in condemning ourselves and judging ourselves for our failings and imperfections. And yesterday we spoke about the importance of confession, the importance of being able to be open in a confident and discreet and safe way with others or with another person about those faults and failings that we must first of all acknowledge to ourselves. But in order to acknowledge them to ourselves, we often need to confess them, to articulate them to another. So I think we can begin to see how this works through the way we learn to meditate. One of the reasons that many people give up meditation is because they think they're not good at it, or they're not perfect at it. And therefore they say, I can't do it. What they often mean is, I don't want to do it because it makes me realize I'm not perfect. And I don't like to see that. And that's why we need to understand meditation itself as a learning process. There's no point at which we become an expert or a master of it, and we become more simple about it, we become more humble about it, we become more familiar with it, but we're not achieving perfection in meditation. So it's a continuous learning process, and all learning involves learning from our failures, from our mistakes, from our distractedness in meditation. We don't like the fact that we are distracted. We would like to be able to be fully focused on the mantra as we say it and leave all our thoughts, plans, and memories behind. But very often we find that we are caught up in our moods, in our ideas, our fantasies, our problems, anxieties, or just simple, silly distractions. So this is why it's helpful for us to understand the process of learning to meditate and to accept that process as a discipline, as a disciple, as someone who is learning, because that's going to have a major impact upon how we live. The early Christians used to say, the way you pray is the way you live. So if we can understand what it is we're doing when we say the mantra, that understanding begins to affect and influence everything else in our life. So even though you don't become a perfect meditator, and even though you may still say to people, I meditate, but I'm a very bad meditator, nevertheless, you keep going joyfully and willingly and happily because you know that it is having a beneficial influence on your life and your relationships. So let's just look just very briefly at how we say the mantra and how learning to say the mantra continuously is teaching us how to live. But first, we start saying the mantra with many distractions and constantly interrupted. Over time, if we persevere, we find that we can say the mantra with more regularity or for longer periods of time. The distractions are still there, the turbulence maybe of our minds is still there, but it's more in the background. And of course, we are still sometimes knocked off our horse, we're distracted, we find ourselves spending half the meditation solving some problem or discovering that we still haven't solved it. We've just thought about it for another half hour. And that happens from time to time with everyone. But incrementally, gradually, over time, we find that we can say the mantra and sound it more with less effort, because it's slowly becoming rooted in us, and our distractions are more there in the background. And then, over time, as this process deepens, as the cumulative influence of meditation increases, we find that we can say the mantra with less effort, and it's more as if we're listening to it. And John Main used to say this is really where our meditation begins to take off, when the attention, in other words, quite naturally comes off ourselves, and even the effort we're making to meditate, and it becomes more natural, more intuitive in a sense. So we're using less effort, and we will find that we have moments where we are in true calmness of mind. Like a day, not quite today, but where there's no clouds in the sky, there are no thoughts in our minds. And sometimes you can suddenly be aware, maybe just for a few moments, that your mind is clear. And you can be aware that over there, you're worrying about all sorts of practical things. But where you are, in the center of the picture, or rather no longer in the center of your own picture, you are free from those thoughts. Now, of course, the thought, I have no thoughts, is a thought. So the temptation or the danger at that point would be to grab at that clarity, at that peace, at that calmness, and to give up the work of the mantra, which is the work of taking the attention off ourselves. Because you say, I don't need to do this work anymore because I've earned this. And I don't get this very often, so let's really make the most of it. But the problem is that as soon as you do that, you've come back into control of the game. And as the ego comes back in control by desiring and manipulating it or trying to possess it, of course, it isn't long before you lose it. In fact, you've lost it already. So that's the wisdom of this tradition, which goes back to our roots of our Christian tradition of prayer, to say the word continuously. And that sometimes puts people off, understandably, because they think, well, that means for the next 50 years I'm going to be sitting here with my hammer, the mantra, bashing at this nail, and like a jackhammer or like that most uncontemplative noise of leaf blowers and strimmers, which I heard this morning. So, but that isn't the case. Because by the time you come to this, you will probably already have allowed the mantra to take root more in your heart, so you are saying the word more gently, more subtly. And it becomes increasingly subtle and increasingly gentle, and there is a decreasing level of effort on our part until the Spirit takes over completely, as we would say, and we enter into the prayer of the Spirit, into the prayer of Christ, which is no longer my prayer at all, because there's no me or mine, no ego reflective process to put that label on anything, even upon our own experience. But we don't engineer that, we can't produce that moment, because, and that's why we call it grace. That's why it's called pure prayer, because there is no ego in it. So that's what the tradition teaches us, and how we personally understand that or apply that is entirely up to us. And none of the great teachers of this tradition have ever said, you have to do it this way, or otherwise you won't get to heaven. But this is the teaching on how to do it if you want to do it, if you want to follow it in this way. If you want to do it another way, then that's fine. But we might as well be clear about what the tradition actually says. So, coming back to the way meditation teaches us how to live the path that we have started on when we say, I'm going to do it now, rather than just thinking about it. I'm going to follow, I'm going to take refuge, I'm going to devote my life to this goal of caring about the well-being of others. So when of course, in doing that, we encounter our own imperfections, our own selfishness, our own egoism. And similarly, when we meditate, we sit down to say the mantra, then we forget we should be saying the mantra. And we're solving our problems, we're indulging a fantasy, or we are pondering over some source of pain or grief. So we forget. And what happens when we forget? By God's grace, we remember. At some point, maybe after 29 minutes and 59 seconds, you say, oh, I should be meditating, I should be saying the mantra, instead of solving that problem. So, what a wonderful grace that is. What a wonderful gift that is. That you can remember what you have forgotten. And so as soon as you remember, you forgive yourself. We'll come back, if we have time, we'll come back to this idea of forgiveness. It's absolutely central to everything we're talking about, this transition from loneliness to love. If we don't learn to forgive, we cannot make this transition. We remain stuck in loneliness. So, we learn this in the very process of learning to say the mantra. We start saying it, we forget, we get distracted, then we remember, and then we forgive ourselves, get over it, leave it in the past, and we start again. We remember, we start the process, we come back to the faithful work of the mantra. So that cycle, which is repeated, more times than we can count, forgetting, forgiving, remembering, starting again, that process puts us in touch with the very deepest momentum within ourselves that takes us on this life journey and that makes our life truly a spiritual, or consciously a spiritual path. At first, of course, the faults that we discover are forgetfulness and the other faults that we looked at yesterday, our gluttony and avarice, our lust and anger, sadness, acedia, vainglory and pride, our laziness, forgetting the teaching, forgetting how to meditate, agitation and dullness, being too tight or too loose with ourselves, our not using the remedies which are at hand, or our over-application, as I mentioned, where you keep doing something when you no longer need to do it. So we will encounter all of these pitfalls, all of these mistakes in greater or lesser degree. And at first, these faults seem huge and powerful, but they are less powerful and less frightening than they at first seem to be. Shantideva calls them weaklings that are subdued by wisdom's glare. So we were talking last night about the gaze of Christ in the icon and how powerful that gaze is. The gaze that recognizes the existence of sadness, but includes that recognition in the gaze of love. So this might be our preferred translation of it, of weaklings to be subdued by the gaze of love. So these faults that we find in ourselves are really scary at first, but expose them to this gaze of love, and these mighty obstacles begin to reduce in size and influence. It's a bit like in American TV shows, which about 90% of American entertainment and plots in TV revolve around who holds the gun. Remember? So, there's always a climax. It's the same pattern in nearly all these programs. There's a climax, and then the goodies and the baddies are, fighting it out at the end, and the baddie has the gun. And the baddie is really mean and frightening and cruel and horrible, but he's got the gun. And then something happens, somebody comes in, or the goodie finds some way of getting the gun. And then suddenly the baddie becomes this pathetic little punk, who has got no power and no courage and so on. Well, it's really a very boring way of telling a story, because it's just everything depends on who has the gun. But I think it can shed some light upon the way that what seems very powerful and oppressive to us can suddenly lift. And we suddenly see that it isn't as frightening or as oppressive as we thought. And as we learn that, the only way we can learn that is by coming back to it, by fidelity to the practice. But then we discover that there is continuous growth. even when we don't seem to be doing well, when our meditation may be in a low bit, or we may even have given up meditation. But continuous growth is still possible if we can admit, confess, and learn from our failures. As I say, the worst way of wasting time is for us to be simply judging ourselves because we're not perfect. In all of these different faults that we have identified in these two traditions, very similar, we could say there's a common element and a common pattern, which is self-centeredness. And perhaps this is the real way that we have to understand sin. What happens if we are faithful to the practice, to the journey, is that we recenter ourselves. The center of awareness, the center of consciousness shifts from ourselves, and therefore from loneliness, because when we are self-centered, we are lonely. Doesn't matter how successful you are, how famous you are, whatever. If your center is in yourself, we are isolated. And the work of any spiritual practice and the work of life as a spiritual journey is to shift to a new center, one, by taking refuge in one who incarnates the goal that we are striving for, and two, loving one another as well as we can, especially those in need, and especially those who hurt or disappoint us. To love others, it is very helpful to take refuge in one who embodies this vision. To love others, in any case, needs vigilance and wakefulness. That's the teaching of the gospel, and it's the teaching of all the wisdom traditions. Shantideva uses two words which are translated variously as mindfulness and awareness. And both of these are linked to the two qualities of meditation itself. One is calmness, a calm mind. Jesus says, set your troubled hearts at rest. He tells us not to worry at the time of prayer, to lay aside our anxieties and our worries. So calmness of mind, not so easy, but that's what we're aiming for. And the other aspect of meditation is insight. Insight, which, as I said the other day, is more about an experience of wisdom, an experience of truth that sends a little ripple through even your body. It's not just an intellectual, a conceptual, abstract perception of truth. It's a full experience of it. We've been touched by it, changed by it. And we don't forget insights. We forget ideas. Even by the time we come back from our walk in the courtyard, even I wouldn't be able to tell you the sequence of ideas that I've been talking about today so far. So ideas, very ephemeral. We hang on to maybe one in a million. But an insight, we never forget. Because an insight incarnates, embodies itself, and becomes part of us. So these are two qualities that related to meditation, calmness of mind and insight, which underlie these qualities of mindfulness and awareness. We don't need to analyze them too much, but just the fact that they are two words, and Buddhists are very good at discriminating and redefining things very, very finely. So mindfulness is associated with remembering. I was carrying a book the other day in the monastery, and Dom Ugo actually noticed that I had left it in the refectory. So I went back and picked it up. Then when we went into the coffee room, I also left it in the coffee room, and he picked it up and gave it to me. So it's about being mindful, remembering where we are, conscious of our environment, conscious of our mental state, conscious even of our body and feelings. Awareness, very closely related to mindfulness, or it is defined often as knowing something accurately, being clear about what we are thinking about or what we are looking at, similar to what you have been doing in the haikus or in the poem we heard yesterday. To know something clearly and accurately in the immediate situation. So if our life is a spiritual journey, we are continually learning how to be present, how to be awake, how to be alert, not in an anxious, self-conscious, self-centered way, but in a way that becomes second nature. We may need little exercises or practices that help us to develop that, but ultimately, it shouldn't be a highly artificial or self-conscious state. It should be one where we enter into single-mindedness. Jesus says, set your mind on God's kingdom before everything else, to be single-minded, in a way that allows us to be perceptive and conscious of everything around us and of ourselves within that environment. That sounds as if we've got to really try hard, but actually, the harder you try to do that, probably the less conscious of the whole context, the whole picture we will be. In any case, the dynamic that is at work, both in the meditation and in the way we live as a result of that meditation, is to become less self-centered. And in finding ourselves to be occupying or to be participating, in a better word really, to be participating in another center rather than just ourselves.